Olá pessoal, tudo bem? Nós vamos iniciar hoje a parte prática da biomecânica analisando dentro do balé clássico. E eu escolhi aqui para vocês dois estudos bem bacana. Um falando sobre a análise do Grand GT, alguns conceitos da biomecânica nós vamos ver aqui nesse vídeo do Grand GT. E também escolhi um vídeo falando sobre pirueta, né? Sobre a análise das piruetas, né? Então vamos assistir esses dois vídeos, analisem bem os conceitos, façam suas anotações. São vídeos que tem um estudo bem bacana. Caso vocês queiram se aprofundar no assunto, vocês podem estar pesquisando também no YouTube, né? Sempre verificando fontes, né? Os conhecimentos de vocês também é para vocês terem base em selecionar esses estudos, né? Para que vocês simplesmente não caiam no contos do vigário, né? Que qualquer pessoa pode postar lá e vocês estarem acreditando nas primeiras coisas que as pessoas estão postando. Então, ter conhecimento nos ajuda a selecionar também bons estudos. Esse que eu trouxe para vocês está bem bacana. Vamos assistir e depois vamos comentar alguns pontos, certo?
In this video, I will be analyzing the biomechanics of a grand jeté. A grand jeté is a leap in ballet that creates an illusion of floating. Through the concepts of projectile motion and center of mass, I will examine exactly how this illusion is created. Let's begin by looking at the phases of a grand jeté. The first phase is the preparation phase, where there is a slight run to gain maximal horizontal velocity and demonstrates a counter movement before jumping. Next is the takeoff phase. This is the phase in which the heel of the first limb and the second limb's toes just lose contact with the ground. Then, the flight phase. This is where the dancer is in the air and both feet are off of the ground. And last is the landing phase, in which both feet reach the ground. Within these phases, center of mass plays a crucial role in the floating illusion. The center of mass is the point at which the entire weight of the body may be considered as concentrated, so that if supported at this point, the body would remain in equilibrium in any position. During the preparation phase and takeoff phase, there is a forward shift in the dancer's center of mass, creating forward and horizontal acceleration. During the flight phase, the center of mass will follow projectile motion. This is due to gravity acting through the center of mass and causing downward acceleration. In the beginning of flight, the lower extremities are low and the center of mass is located in the abdomen. The center of mass ascends upward as the lower extremities lift and reaches peak trajectory. After peak trajectory, the center of mass then begins to descend along with the extremities until landing phase. Projectile motion also plays an important role in the floating illusion. We have just touched on projectile motion when looking at the center of mass during the flight phase, but there is much more to it. Let's begin by defining projectile motion. It is the motion of an air-bound object in which the only external forces acting on the object are gravity and air resistance. From the moment of takeoff to landing, the dancer's gravity follows a parabolic trajectory. In a normal projectile motion, the peak height is apparent. However, in the dancer's motion, the head seems to float horizontally at the highest point. When the dancer is in the air, the horizontal component of velocity will remain constant. However, the vertical component will change due to the gravity and the center of mass. The vertical component begins by accelerating upward until it reaches peak height. At peak height, the vertical velocity reaches 0, and then decreases as the dancer descends towards the ground. Horizontal velocity remains constant throughout the projectile motion. So what changes how the trajectory looks in a dancer during a grand jeté compared to what a regular object might look during projectile motion? At peak height exactly, the legs are raised to a split and the arms are raised overhead. The head and abdomen will continue to move horizontally, even though that we know center of mass is descending during this time. Onlookers observe the head and torso in a grand jeté rather than the center of mass. Therefore, synchronizing the timing of the largest split, the highest arm elevation angle, and the peak of gravity and center of mass creates an illusion of horizontal motion in flight and the illusion of floating.
Meu nome é Marcos Saravalli, eu sou estrategista de investimentos e responsável por guiar centenas de pessoas ao sucesso no mercado financeiro.
In the third act of Swan Lake, the black swan pulls off a seemingly endless series of turns, bobbing up and down on one pointed foot and spinning around and around and around 32 times. It's one of the toughest sequences in ballet, and for those 30 seconds or so, she's like a human top in perpetual motion. Those spectacular turns are called fouettes, which means whipped in French, describing the dancer's incredible ability to whip around without stopping. But while we're marveling at the fouette, can we unravel its physics? The dancer starts the fouette by pushing off with her foot to generate torque. But the hard part is maintaining the rotation. As she turns, friction between her point shoe and the floor, and somewhat between her body and the air, reduces her momentum. So how does she keep turning? Between each turn, the dancer pauses for a split second and faces the audience. Her supporting foot flattens and then twists as it rises back onto point, pushing against the floor to generate a tiny amount of new torque. At the same time, her arms sweep open to help her keep her balance. The turns are most effective if her center of gravity stays constant, and a skilled dancer will be able to keep her turning axis vertical. The extended arms and torque-generating foot both help drive the fouette, but the real secret, and the reason you hardly notice the pause, is that her other leg never stops moving. During her momentary pause, the dancer's elevated leg straightens and moves from the front to the side before it folds back into her knee. By staying in motion, that leg is storing some of the momentum of the turn. When the leg comes back in towards the body, that stored momentum gets transferred back to the dancer's body, propelling her around as she rises back onto point. As the ballerina extends and retracts her leg with each turn, momentum travels back and forth between leg and body, keeping her in motion. A really good ballerina can get more than one turn out of every leg extension in one of two ways. First, she can extend her leg sooner. The longer the leg is extended, the more momentum it stores, and the more momentum it can return to the body when it's pulled back in. More angular momentum means she can make more turns before needing to replenish what was lost to friction. The other option is for the dancer to bring her arms or leg in closer to her body once she returns to point. Why does this work? Like every other turn in ballet, the fouette is governed by angular momentum, which is equal to the dancer's angular velocity times her rotational inertia. And except for what's lost to friction, that angular momentum has to stay constant while the dancer is on point. That's called conservation of angular momentum. Now, rotational inertia can be thought of as a body's resistance to rotational motion. It increases when more mass is distributed further from the axis of rotation, and decreases when the mass is distributed closer to the axis of rotation. So as she brings her arms closer to her body, her rotational inertia shrinks. In order to conserve angular momentum, her angular velocity, the speed of her turn, has to increase, allowing the same amount of stored momentum to carry her through multiple turns. You've probably seen ice skaters do the same thing, spinning faster and faster by drawing in their arms and legs. In Tchaikovsky's ballet, the Black Swan is a sorceress, and her 32 captivating fouettes do seem almost supernatural. But it's not magic that makes them possible, it's physics.
Bom, a gente assistiu esses dois vídeos, né? E eu tenho uns comentários para fazer para vocês. Como vocês podem ver aqui nessa imagem, nesse videozinho aqui do lado, né? Tem N programas que vocês podem pesquisar, softwares que vão auxiliar para realizar essas análises tanto cinesiológicas, biomecânicas, né? Esse, por exemplo, é um programinha, né? Que tem... né, ali o movimento não está sendo realizado tão perfeitamente, mas é para mostrar, né? A pessoa que postou esse videozinho, né, de um programa que faz a análise, né, com eletrodos, né, você consegue visualizar dessa forma e ali a gente consegue ver os músculos que estão sendo acionados durante o fouetté, né. Então a gente consegue ter uma noção, como que a gente fala, quando a gente fala, qual o músculo que está mais ativo, menos ativo durante o movimento, né? Por exemplo, esses equipamentos, essas análises podem nos dar as respostas bem claras sobre essa movimentação, e aqui fica um exemplo para vocês também, certo? São softwares, às vezes, que lógico que são mais caros de se comprar, com alguns equipamentos que você precisa ter, né? Mas para quem depois quer fazer pesquisa na área, quem gosta, né? Pode estar se aprofundando também, certo? Para a gente pôr um ponto final nessa aula, eu peço para vocês que vocês, numa folha de papel, vocês pensem nos 2 vídeos que vocês assistiram, dessas 2 análises, né? E coloque os conceitos que nós vimos nas aulas, que vocês conseguem visualizar nessas 2 análises. Nós encerramos a nossa aula por aqui e nos vemos na próxima. Até mais!